In August, I preached a sermon here on tectonic shifts in the global landscape. It was on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I. And 100 years later, we see, for example, that the end of the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I, and with it, the effective end of the Islamic Caliphate, radically affected Islam. In the words of historian Philip Jenkins, as a political force, Islam in 1914 was inconceivably weaker than it is today. There were perhaps at that time 240 million Muslims in the world, so that Christians outnumbered Muslims by 2.5 to 1, compared to a modern ratio of 1.5. The number of Muslims alive in 1914 was not much larger than the modern Muslim population of just Indonesia. As promised, I said I would pick up there in a forthcoming sermon in October, and here we are. And that historical note about the end of the Islamic Caliphate in the wake of the First World War seems all the more relevant now, with the terrorist group ISIS, Phyllis mentioned some of this earlier, dominating headlines with horrific acts of savagery in an effort to reestablish an Islamic caliphate. From the Arabic word for succession, the word caliphate is an Islamic empire ruled by a religious and political leader known as a caliph, who is seen as a successor to Muhammad. But long before ISIS started making headlines, I planned to preach this Sunday about Islam, because as we gather here in this sanctuary, more than 2 million Muslims are nearing the end of the annual week-long pilgrimage to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, known as the Hajj. And Hajj is simply the Arabic word for pilgrimage. And it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam that all Muslims are expected to make sometime in their lifetime if they are able physically and able financially. There's an old saying that the difference between a pilgrim and a tourist is that a tourist passes through a place, but a pilgrim allows a place to pass through them. And Muslims who have completed the Hajj report feeling more connected to the sacred, to their own deepest selves, and to the diverse worldwide Muslim community known as the Ummah. The other 4 pillars of Islam, if we had more time, I'd do a quiz to see how many of us could name them, are Shahada, testimony, Salat, prayer, Ramadan, the annual month-long fast, and Zakat, almsgiving. The Shahada is one single sentence. So unlike traditional Christianity with that long Nicene Creed, it's just one sentence about monotheism and about the trustworthiness of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings about that one God. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And you may notice that I said the word God there instead of Allah, and that's because Allah is nothing more than the Arabic word for God. Arabic Christians, Arabic Jews, when they're speaking about God or praying to God, they also use the word Allah. It's just the Arabic word for God. Muslims are also called to pray 5 times per day, sunrise, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and evening, to fast from dawn to dusk, each day during the month of Ramadan, abstaining from food, drink, smoking, sex, and anger, and to give 2.5% of their wealth, not of their income, but of their wealth annually to charity. From a Unitarian Universalist perspective, the most significant aspects of the 5 pillars of Islam is that they make Islam what is known as an orthopraxy, about right action, not an orthodoxy, about right belief. Unitarian Universalism, we are also an orthodoxy. We believe in deeds, not creeds. That religion is much more about ethics than believing 6 impossible things before breakfast, as the White Queen told Alice she sometimes does. So one important piece of hope for the future of Islam is focusing on this ethical framework of the 5 pillars and focusing it ever more fully on social justice, as well as supporting those who are reinterpreting traditional Islam through the lens of science, democracy, and human rights. But I invite you to consider that the future of Islam is not merely about how we want Islam to change. Rather, we should consider how Islam might inform the future of Unitarian Universalism. What might we learn, for example, from the 5 pillars of Islam? What if once in a lifetime, all Unitarian Universalists who are able, physically and financially, were encouraged to make a pilgrimage to our Mecca? Anybody want to guess? Boston, right? Some of you may know the old joke that in the 19th century, Unitarianism was about the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. Or what about a pilgrimage to the many sites around Concord, related to the 19th century Transcendentalist movement? Or to Transylvania to explore the 16th century European roots of Unitarianism? Or to Murray Grove on the New Jersey shore, where John Murray, the founder of Universalism in America, first preached Universalism in 1770. How might your Unitarian Universalism be transformed, not by passing through those places as a tourist, but by allowing them to pass through you? Relatedly, how might Unitarian Universalism be strengthened if all you use pause 5 times per day at different points to practice whatever spiritual discipline you choose and that most resonates with you? Or spend 1 month per year intensively practicing and focusing on your spiritual path? Or if all you use annually contributed 2.5% of their wealth? As you can likely guess, most Americans are not asking what they might learn from Islam. Rather, 57% of Americans, well into a majority, when asked, what do you admire about Muslim societies, say either nothing or I don't know. Years after 9/11, nearly 2/3 of Americans confess that they do not have even a basic understanding about Islam. And in light of such ignorance, 40 years ago, when a fundamentalist Christian minister received an irresponsible amount of media attention for his offensive, self-declared International Burn a Quran Day, some of you may remember this, that was his way of how he recommended that we should religiously commemorate September 11th that year. I joined many of my theologically progressive colleagues in abandoning the sermon I had planned to preach that following Sunday to preach on International Read a Quran Day. And although the First Amendment can be read as protecting the right of any individual or group to burn any book, I feel called to use that same freedom of speech and freedom of religion to discourage acts of division, violence, and hate, and instead to model a more compassionate, inclusive, and healthy way of being religious, as we seek to do here. And to place Islamophobic acts, such as International Burn a Quran Day, in historical perspective, it's important to remember that the way Islam is perceived today in the West, especially after 9/11, is vastly different than the past, vastly different than 100 years ago. For most of the 20th century, no one in the West was paying attention to Islam, in the government, in academia, in the media. Then the Iranian Revolution happened. In 1979, the world looked on as in stunned disbelief as an aged Ayatollah living in exile in Paris led a revolution that overthrew one of the most powerful rulers in the Middle East. In my own study of Islam, the scholar I have found most helpful is John Esposito, the longtime professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. Esposito is a Roman Catholic from an Italian family raised in Brooklyn. He spent a decade in a monastery, then through a series of coincidences ended up studying Islam at Temple University. He graduated with a PhD there in 1974. I had the opportunity to hear Esposito deliver the president's address. He's the current president of the American Academy of Religion when it last met in Baltimore in November. And for anyone interested, I'll link to the text of his address if you'd like to read that for yourself. But my point is that it was fascinating to hear Esposito speak about the evolution of Islam in the West over his academic career. He was studying Islam intensively as a doctoral student in the 70s when hardly anyone else was. He was beginning to teach Islamic studies when the Iranian Revolution happened. And he has been at the peak of his career as a widely respected senior scholar in the wake of 9/11. My sermon title is a direct allusion to his 2010 book with Oxford University Press. It's quite accessible, and it is called The Future of Islam. That's a great starting point if this sermon leaves you curious to learn more. And in considering the future of Islam, maybe the most important piece of data to consider is demographics. There are approximately, so remember we talked about there being 240 million Muslims in the world in World War I? There are now 1.5 billion alive today, making Islam the world's second largest religion. There are about 2.1 million Christians. And although terrorist groups who claim to speak for all Muslims must be dealt with seriously, such extremists are not representative of the vast majority of Muslims. Indeed, not only are overwhelming numbers of Muslims not terrorists or terrorist sympathizers, but also, contrary to popular stereotypes, most Muslims aren't Arab. Only 1 in 5 Muslims are Arab, 20%. And the countries with the largest Muslim populations, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Nigeria, those 5, they're all democracies. So contrary to the popular belief that Islam and democracies are incompatible. In the words of a religion professor from American University in DC, Saudi Arabia, where Mecca is, has the 16th largest Muslim population, 16th, behind countries such as Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Turkey, and Iran. For what it's worth, Saudi Arabia's Muslim population is roughly equivalent to the Muslim population in China. All of this should make us reconsider how we perceive not only Islam, but also the locus of its power and influence. While the Saudi government routinely casts itself as the protector and defender of the faith, they represent only a small fraction of the world's Muslims. So the huge number of Muslims outside the Middle East show both the diversity of Islam in the present, as well as a hope for an increasingly open and pluralistic Islam in the future. Tragically, however, both ignorance and Islamophobia have caused our country in recent years to do as much harm as good in laying the groundwork for Islam's future. Phyllis spoke about some of this earlier in relation to Nancy Pace's letter. Abuses in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, as well as Guantanamo Bay and the rendition of prisoners in countries employing harsh interrogation techniques and torture, that undermines our country's record of human rights and outrages not only Muslims, but many others in the world. U.S. foreign policy also undermines the future of Islam and our future on this planet, as Mary spoke about earlier, when we embrace doctrines of preemptive strikes, when we sidestep the Geneva Accords and try to exempt ourselves from any sort of international accountability. Conversely, perhaps the single best way we can actually contribute to a hopeful future for both Islam and this planet is investing in the education of women around the globe. And to inverse our perspective further, what if we ask, what do Muslims say? Not what do we say about Muslims, but what do Muslims say about us in the West, as well as about themselves? The best starting point I've found is a fascinating book published in 2007. Esposito was one of the editors. It's titled, Who Speaks for Islam? What a billion Muslims really think based on the Gallup's World Poll, the largest study of its kind. As a counterpoint to the majority of Americans who say there is nothing to admire about Muslim societies, Muslims said that what they admire least about Western society, so if you're going to say that about us, here's what we say about you. They say, 18-year-old youngsters in the West are independent and make any decision. Their parents have no importance, and they misbehave in front of their parents. They are vulgar, with no respect for elders. They have weak family bonds and don't care about other people's feelings. And if you want to hear Muslims speaking for themselves about Islam, one of the most fascinating places I've found to listen is on Twitter. How many of you are on Twitter? Anybody? All right, good. Good. I particularly recommend the hashtags #NotYourStockMuslim and Muslim apologies. And those aren't real apologies, those are sarcastic apologies, as you're about to see. Here's just a few examples. We come from different backgrounds. We have different experiences. We can't be homogenized into one voice. Not your stock Muslim. Angry terrorist number 3. Brown taxi cab driver. Slumdog millionaire's second stunt double. That is not my LinkedIn profile. Not your stock Muslim. Both East and West Indian, in a sorority, active in public health activism and active for reproductive justice. Not your stock Muslim. My Muslim parents were the first people to expose me to feminism. Not your stock Muslim. Both my younger sisters who practice hijab are on their high school sports team, basketball and gymnastics. Not your stock Muslim. Lefty feminist Muslim, fave memory bringing home agnostic white boy, my Muslim father was the first to step up and support. Not your stock Muslim. I met my husband through the traditional Desi marriage process. I chose this. 11 years and 2 kids later, never happy. Not your stock Muslim. We're not 2D characters who either pray and hate the West or drink alcohol and love the West. Not your stock Muslim. Investment counselor who wears pantsuits with her hijab to work because she's not your stock Muslim, except when she's actually dealing with stocks. I'm sorry you tapped my phone and all you learned was that I was planning a potluck at the mosque on Friday. Muslim apologies. I'm sorry that I don't know how to use an AK-47. Muslim apologies. I'm sorry you tripped while staring at me. Muslim apologies. Now these are just a small sample of the 21st century Muslim voices that give me hope for the future of Islam. So what causes the opposite, extremist voices, to emerge? Studies by the European Network of Experts on Violent Radicalization, on global terrorism and suicide bombing have found that in most cases, religion is not the primary source of most extremist behavior. In fact, most terrorists are neither particularly religiously literate or religiously observant. Drivers of radicalization include moral outrage, disaffection, peer pressure, the search for a new identity and for a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. Being poor, being young, being male, and being unemployed, all contributing factors. Polls show that a majority of Muslims worldwide want the same thing we in the West generally want. Better economics, law and order they can trust, democratic ideals, eradicating illiteracy and ignorance, gender equality, social justice, religious freedom. For me, the takeaway is that decreasing wealth inequality, educating the public about the diversity of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims, and supporting the education of women are all major steps that we can do to work for a healthy future for Islam, for us, and for this planet. May we do our part in bringing about such a future. I invite you to reflect briefly on how what I've said intersects with what you've experienced about Islam, about Muslims who are maybe your neighbor, your doctor, your professor, in your family, in this congregation. So reflect briefly about that, and then there'll be a time